I wanted to summarize the 4 key things that have happened in the past 2 years that have changed the nature of Amtrak's reality and the conversations that we have about intercity rail in the United States, and break them into outcomes that are really very promising and exciting, and then other things that are a bit challenging. A few comments about the stimulus awards for high-speed or higher-speed rail, as well as Amtrak's presence here in the Pacific Northwest. And then talk about this year's appropriation and next year's appropriation as they relate to Amtrak generally, but also about the Pioneer and North Coast Hiawatha routes. And then have time for your comments and questions. So, I think everybody knows most of this, but just to summarize, in the past 2 years, 4 key things have happened that have impacted intercity rail. The first, of course, is that in October 2008, President Bush signed what we call our reauthorization, or PREA. We can just call it the reauthorization for this after this conversation. And I will tell you what that was supposed to do. And I don't know if I should what that means. Because it was supposed to do some things, and some of those things simply are not happening. And I'll explain what I mean a little bit later on. In February of last year, President Obama signed stimulus legislation, which included a total of $9.3 billion for intercity rail. And then in December, President Obama signed Amtrak's appropriation for FY10, which includes an additional $2.5 billion in capital for intercity rail. And then, of course, in January, we had the announcements about the recipients of the $8 billion in high-speed rail grants. So the impacts of these things have been, in terms of PREA, I'm going to actually pull this off if I may. Well, never mind. In terms of PREA, it outlined Congress's expectation that Amtrak is to operate a national system. Prior to that time, there had been all this rancor around the long-distance trains. Should we operate them? Should we just operate corridor trains, etc.? What PREA did is it said it is the policy of the United States that Amtrak provide a nationally connected intercity service, which includes corridor trains. Thank you. Corridor trains as well as long-distance trains. That's the first thing. Additionally, it provided a framework for the federal government to provide capital funding for states for their use in expanding corridor intercity rail services. It focused attention on our host railroads and how well they dispatch Amtrak service, because as you saw by that Leeds train board, key to all of these outcomes is reliability. It mandated that Amtrak perform some studies, such as North Coast Hiawatha, the Pioneer, New Orleans East, and it created a 2015 mandate for positive train control for the entire nation, which is a good thing. How it's going to be funded is a bit unknown. So that's what the reauthorization did. Because remember, Amtrak is subordinate to the federal government. So we take our cues from the federal government. We can't get ahead of the federal government. And so PREA says to Amtrak, these are your marching orders. Now implement them. So that was the first change. The second change is the stimulus legislation. Amtrak, as a provider, received $1.3 billion. And we are using that to return 81 cars to service, 15 locomotives. We are improving our shops in Chicago, Los Angeles, and Miami. We are engaging in key upgrades to certain bridges, signal components, etc. on the Northeast Corridor. ADA improvements, station improvements at some stations nationwide, along with safety and security improvements. So really, we are using those stimulus dollars to take P42s, like that wreck damage one there on the lower left, and restore it to a serviceable and operable condition as evidenced by that P42 on the right. That's what we're using our stimulus dollars for. In the lunch line today, someone made the comment, Amtrak had all the stimulus money, and is that really going to serve as the backbone for dramatically different Amtrak service. In terms of stimulus, the money that Amtrak got, the answer is no. Because remember, although we received $1.3 billion in capital, for which we are very grateful, on the Northeast Corridor alone, we have a $5 billion state of good repair backlog. We have a $1.5 billion backlog in Station 88 compliance. So the $1.3 billion is fantastic, and again, we are not ungrateful. At the same time, it doesn't solve our capital investment needs. It helps us work through some of that backlog, but does not eliminate the backlog. In terms of the stimulus money for high-speed or higher-speed rail, $8 billion in capital. Those announcements were made at the end of January. And among other things, the announcements will facilitate true high-speed rail service in California and Florida. Those funds will provide a capital infusion for Ohio's 3C corridor, Cleveland, Columbus, Cincinnati. A capital infusion for 110-mile-an-hour service, Madison, Chicago to St. Louis. Of course, over $500 million here to Amtrak Cascade service, primarily between Seattle and Portland. And the 90-mile-an-hour service, Washington to Charlotte. Now, as everyone knows, this $8 billion is a down payment on high-speed rail or higher-speed rail. You cannot buy high-speed rail for $8 billion. That said, this initial down payment is being followed up this fiscal year, FY10, with an additional $2.5 billion. Now, of course, the difference is the $2.5 billion will be matched federal money. So it'll be 80% federal, 20% local. The $8 billion was a straight grant, which of course took into account prior investments. But the difference is this next infusion of capital money is going to require that states put up at least 20%, which is comparable to what states do for highways, transit, and aviation in some instances. Now, those four things taken together, what do those mean that's really very favorable for Amtrak and American Intercity Rail? The first thing is that it allows us to have a degree of stability that allows for more candid acknowledgments. I can stand here in front of you and say, we need more long-distance rolling stock. I could not have said that 5 years ago. I can stand before you and say, the configuration of the network should perhaps be altered if there's the money to pay for it. That wasn't the case 5 years ago. You knew it was the case. I knew it was the case. But I couldn't say so and still get paid. But now I can do that. We can talk about the long-distance trains are key linkages between these corridor services, and they provide vital access to rural communities. We've always known that to be the case. There's all this sort of political bickering back and forth about the long-distance trains. That has been solved temporarily. Our board, our CEO, expects me and my colleagues to be active stewards of these trains, to advocate for them, to say what is not working well about them, to pay attention to them, and to have some ownership over them. You've always had that. Many of us have had that as well. But now we have the permission to be more actively engaged in the management of these trains. So that doesn't result in tangible outcomes like new rolling stock, more frequencies, better running times, but it changes the nature of the conversations, and that is significant. The other thing is that Amtrak has the opportunity to demonstrate to the nation, to our state partners as a Washington State DOT, Oregon DOT, commuter partners, Sound Transit, etc., that we have a wealth of expertise operating passenger trains. And our goal is to be America's passenger rail operator of choice for intercity service, for commuter service in many instances, and we are willing and want to have conversations about how we can become involved contractually and actually being a part of high-speed rail. So we now have the ability to think about time frames longer than one-year appropriation cycles. We can talk about the future without hesitation, and that's also a fantastic thing. Now finally, these changes mean that tangible improvements are coming. And I know you haven't seen them yet, but trust me, they really are going to happen. We are going to order new rolling stock. Maybe not all that you want when you want it, but new cars and locomotives are going to be ordered. There are going to be additional frequencies within certain corridors primarily, pending identification of the operating funding. I'll explain that a little bit more later on. You will see improved stations, like Schmaltz will have a new platform to complement the Connect Oregon funded station there. You will see more platforms that are 8 inches above top of rail with nice paved edges for accessibility. There'll be those kinds of improvements happening nationwide. And all of those things and others will result in intercity rail having a more favorable image, which should make it a little bit easier to get additional operating funding and capital funding needed to advance this mode, so that eventually you will have a reality like the one we saw in Lauren's video. We have integrated services between modes where there's no this kind of bickering, where you really understand it is the needs of the travelers that dictate how you design facilities, coordinate schedules, in order to enjoy true intermodalism. We're going to be a part of that, and those poor outcomes are going to allow us to do that to a certain extent. Now, given that this is Amtrak, it's always kind of a mixed bag. That's sort of the way it goes, unfortunately. And here's what's a little challenging about our reality. And that is, as all of you know, intercity rail's needs are pretty significant and they are expensive. And those aren't Amtrak's needs, those are the mode's needs. So you can get rid of Amtrak. The fact remains that you've got to have sustained capital operating investment in order for this mode to work. The other unknown is how long this window, if you will, is going to remain open, because we have a pro-rail administration right now. That's not a guarantee that we will always have that kind of situation in the White House. So that's a significant unknown. The other thing is that the capital money that is coming to the states is really designed to help them improve corridor service. However, it is up to the states to identify the operating funding. So it is, I think, a fairly easy argument to say, we have just gotten X amount of money from the federal government. Now let's honor that kind of investment by throwing out $5, $10, $50 million of operating funding to kind of keep these trains going. That's easy for me to justify, but I'm not trying to fund public safety, education, elder care, etc. So the burden is on the states to match that federal money with operating funds. And if that doesn't happen, then you are not going to have 2 additional round trips, Seattle to Portland. You are not going to have the 3C corridor, etc. And in this time of constrained state budgets, it is not guaranteed that these states will be able to find the operating dollars. I'm optimistic they will. Hopefully you are along with me, but it's not a guarantee. The other challenge is that Amtrak's appropriation remains inadequate. The reauthorization provided funding targets. That is different than how much money we actually are appropriate on an annual basis. And I'm going to show what I mean by that in a few slides from now. But the reauthorization changed the nature of the conversation. However, the amount of money that actually has been flowing into Amtrak's coffers remains the same as it's been really for decades. We ask for one amount. In this case, we also are reauthorized at a certain amount. We are getting some amount less, and that has not changed. Another unknown is that when the economy rebounds and freight train traffic levels return to where they had been previously, how will our trains perform? I would like to think the reauthorization's attention on freight railroad performance is is going to mean that they will continue providing the prioritization that our trains really do deserve and require. And I think some railroads will do that because it's the right thing to do, although it's not guaranteed. So again, yet another unknown. Next, there are still some outstanding national challenges. ADA compliance, positive train control, etc. How those things will be funded, how they'll be implemented, and what they actually mean for this mode. So again, I'm not trying to be doom and gloom, but all I'm saying is, yes, people are talking about a revolution in intercity rail. This is a new day for passenger service, and to an extent that is true. But there are some tentacles, if you will, of the old that are kind of dragging behind this mode. And those tentacles are significant, and they can't be ignored. So to provide you with an accurate sense of where this mode resides in 2010. Because people are paying attention. People's expectations are really high. They hear high-speed rail, and they think TGV, Shinkansen, Thales, etc. We are not there as a nation. Should we be there? Of course, but we aren't there. And so we're going to have to bring people's expectations down so that they understand, here's what we can afford right now. Now let's get that constructed, let's reap the successes that will accrue, and then we move forward to the next tier of success. In terms of the high-speed rail stimulus grants, the $8 billion, a few comments. As I mentioned before, this is a down payment on high-speed rail or higher-speed rail. And regardless of what corridor you're passionate about, $8 billion does not help you. I mean, it helps realize your dreams. It doesn't address all of your needs. So that's the first thing. That said, perspective is important. Remember that 2 years ago, this mode had $30 million in federal money available for states to access for capital improvements. Now, this year, there's a total of $10.5 billion, combination of stimulus and $2.5 billion in federal capital matching. That's a pretty dramatic difference. The other thing to keep in mind is that everyone's needs, I think, are legitimate, their desires reasonable, their visions held dearly by its advocates, but not everyone's needs can be addressed right now. So I think grace is important. And what I mean by that is Washington State got $590 million, Oregon got $8 million. I understand that there's disappointment, frustration, etc. The first thing is, this was the first effort to distribute a meaningful amount of high-speed rail capital money from the federal government. That's the first thing. The second is, I think it's important to understand that a rising tide raises all boats. So we should want the 3C corridor to be successful in Ohio, because that's going to raise the profile of passenger trains in the Midwest. That will then help efforts to get passenger service or more passenger service to Minneapolis, St. Paul, to Duluth, down to Chicago. That's going to help put pressure on Montana for the North Coast Hiawatha. That will help put pressure on for service east of Seattle to Spokane, etc. So all of your needs are legitimate, but the ability to fund all of those needs is staggering. So I think animosity and kind of finger pointing, those things aren't useful. What is useful is grace and satisfaction, knowing that as a nation, we are on the cusp of beginning to realize what passenger trains can provide to all of us as Americans. As far as true high-speed rail is concerned, Amtrak believes in high-speed rail. It's a valuable tool, and we look forward to having our services integrated with true high-speed rail services, and in some instances where it makes sense for us, entering into a relationship with those entities to operate, to build, to maintain, etc. So we look forward to the emergence of true high-speed rail in the United States. Now, go from broad to specific. Amtrak in this region, how are we doing? It's still a very compelling story. Amtrak cascades this year to date up almost 18%, The reliability, as evidenced by today's performance, is a little lacking at 72%. The Empire Builder, essentially holding a study on ridership, has had a challenging winter, and I apologize for that in a lot of respects, because we had equipment problems, annulments, late terminal departures, frozen equipment en route. That train, I love it, and it has had a rough winter. That said, OTP is not horrible at around 80%. The Coast Starlight, however, is a rock star. I mean, you talk about a dramatic turnaround. Ridership up just over 7%. On-time performance, 88% year to date. Of course, that train had been zero. So the Coast Starlight is truly something to crow about, and you can rely on it 9 times out of 10, knock on wood. That has to continue. Regarding the second train to Vancouver, BC, Amtrak appreciates all the work that WashDOT, Cascadia, and others have done to secure that train. Everybody has driven the ridership growth in Amtrak Cascades, and we hope for a stable and permanent outcome to the cross-border situations. That train can really be integrated into the national network in the long term. I think our friends in Oregon deserve a round of applause for 2 things. The first is, consider that 3 years ago, the conversation had always been in Oregon. Can they fund 2 trains? Should 1 train go away? Can they afford 2 round trips, Portland to Eugene? Not only have they been able to fund 1 round trip through a quasi-dedicated funding source, but they also have invested $35 million for 2 new Talgo train sets, and, which is not insignificant, and they have invested $300 million in non-highway capital funding. Now granted, those dollars have not all gone for passenger rail, but in terms of a change in orientation, much like the Coast Starlight, Oregon is experiencing a revolution as well. And I think given where they had been 3, 5, 10 years ago, we owe the folks of Oregon a tremendous round of applause, our appreciation for their passion, because their attention to detail is beginning to pay off. So, Oregon, congratulations. And of course, we continue being very proud of what we do here in the Seattle area with Washington State, DOT, Amtrak Cascades, Sound Transit, BNSF, etc. So our story here is really pretty positive. And what's equally exciting is what Amtrak is doing with the maintenance facility here in Seattle. We are funding out of our own capital dollars phases 1 and 2 of a 4-phase facility to transform what is a largely outdoor facility. So this first building, phase 1, again funded by Amtrak's capital money, construction will begin in the spring. It will serve as an inspection facility primarily for the Talgo train sets. Unlike the current facility, it can accommodate the entire train set, or I should say the train sets. Right now, the sets are advanced 1 car at a time, which is just, it's worked beautifully thanks to Talgo's maintenance philosophy, but in terms of a quality work environment, it is lacking. This solves that problem. This building will also have power hookups for electricity, toilets, water, etc. They'll have inspection pits. So this is a dramatic improvement in the quality of the conditions that our Seattle employees will be working in this case. Phase 2, again, also begins this spring, funded by Amtrak Capital, is a 3-story health and welfare and warehouse facility. Warehouse on the bottom floor, offices, locker rooms, lunchrooms, etc. on the top 2 floors. If you've taken the train south, especially on the old alignment, you probably saw a collection of trailers, right? Have you seen those trailers? Okay. So this facility gets rid of Trailer Town. So we will finally have our employees in a proper kind of facility that allows for a higher quality work environment. They will be happier. It's just the right thing to do. Now, phases 3 and 4, we want to construct, but we don't have the money to do that just yet. Phase 3 is an enclosed facility that will allow the tracks that the Empire Builder uses, the Coast Starlight, Sound Transit, those cars to be actually serviced in an enclosed manner as opposed to the open air pits that are used right now. And Phase 4 is an enclosed locomotive shop. So we are trying to explain to our friends in Congress why we need the capital funding for Phases 3 and 4 to truly transform the Seattle shop. That said, these first 2 phases are actually going to start construction in the spring. So these are not theoretical, these are not plans, this and that and the other. You will actually see bulldozers, dirt being moved, walls being constructed. Now let's talk about the appropriation. And I'm not a huge numbers person, but I think we need to walk through this because this explains the status of the Pioneer and the North Coast Hiawatha. So the first thing is that on the left-hand side, there are 2 kinds of money. Simply speaking, this is not actually the case, but kind of break it down. There are 2 kinds of money. There's operating money and capital money. On the operating side, we have what is actually allowed for in the reauthorization versus what Amtrak gets via the appropriation. So as you can see, fiscal year 2008, pre-reauthorization, the corporation actually had under $500 million for operations. So that's to actually put the trains over the road, food, fuel, salaries, stations, etc. On the capital side, we had under $600 million. That pays for rolling stock acquisition, repairs, revamping stations, etc. So that's the baseline for this conversation. Advance 1 year, FY 2009. The reauthorization is in play. The authorized operating amount, $530 million. We ended up getting a little more than that at $550 million for operating. The authorized capital amount, $715 million. We got just under $700 million. All right? Now advance to this year, 2010. The authorized operating amount, $580 million. Authorized capital, just under $1 billion. We are actually working on the operating side this year with under $600 million. Now on the capital side, it's about $1 billion. So you can see the trend, right? Now on the capital side, we are getting a more increasingly robust appropriation. On the operating side, the appropriated level still remains below the authorized level. The North Coast Hiawatha and the Pioneer, rolling stock aside, station upgrades aside, those trains and others exist within that operating number. Or, more importantly, they do not exist given the current operating number. Theoretically, if Amtrak had been appropriated at the authorized amount, there would be, a $62 million increase on the operating side, FY09, FY11. That could have potentially paid for a Hiawatha or the Pioneer. The cars, locomotives, that's a pretty big if, but nonetheless, you had some flexibility. Right now, we don't have that, particularly if fuel prices go up or our base wage rate increases. So I share that with you because for next fiscal year, FY11, the authorized operating amount is just under $600 million. The authorized capital amount is over $1 billion. The president has proposed, again, less than $600 million for operating and about $1 billion for capital. So that is the best case scenario. We'll see what Congress wants to do with those numbers. I guess my point is the trend that has largely defined Amtrak's existence. We ask for one thing, we get some amount less, we have to manage the difference. That continues to this day. So with that, I want to again thank you for your time, the chance to speak with you this afternoon, And I really do believe that there's a lot of very good news regarding intercity rail in the United States. It's not perfect, but it certainly is the start of a new day. And our goal is, again, to be a safer, greener, and healthier interconnected railroad. So thank you for your support, for your patronage, and all aboard.
You said we should lower our expectations. I wonder why you wouldn't say raise our expectations, especially after his presentation. When you look at the military budget, they get everything they want. Why don't we find a way to fight for what we want?
I completely agree with you. And I meant lower expectations in terms of.
Would you repeat the question, please?
She was saying that I made the comment that people should lower their expectations around the $8 billion in high-speed rail capital dollars, because people have very high visions of what high-speed rail should look like, or very grand visions, and that won't be realized with $8 billion in investment. So my point in making that comment was that the average person hears high-speed rail. America's going to have high-speed rail. We are investing in high-speed rail. They are not going to get a TGV-style system for $8 billion. Now, should those individuals want that outcome and want those trains to be interconnected and to accommodate bicycles? Of course they should, without a doubt. But in terms of what we can actually buy, given the available level of funding, it's not going to be a TGV-style system. So in that sense, we have to lower what we think is actually going to materialize in the short term, but not lose sight of a grander vision. That's my point. Is that clearer?
I'm not satisfied.
Fair enough.
Sir, you're speaking of connecting all of our country together, but I hear nothing of what's going on in the last 5 years from New Orleans to Orlando. Nothing. What's happened?
Repeat that question.
Repeat the question.
The question was about service from New Orleans East, and that there is a mandate that Amtrak has via the reauthorization to have a national system, and yet the corporation has done nothing tangible to restore service from New Orleans East. Much like the Hiawatha and the Pioneer, we will operate service New Orleans East if we have the capital operating funds to do so. So much like those two western long-haul routes, a study was performed, we gave it to Congress, and we await their direction. And to date, they have not given us that direction. So until they do, that will remain a gap in the system. Now, should it? That's debatable. But in terms of what we can actually buy, given our appropriation, we can't afford right now service from New Orleans East. But we've outlined options to Congress, and we will do what they wish if they fund it.
The $563 million in operating funds, what is Amtrak's revenue in relation to that 563?
Good question. Our cost recovery, the question was, with Amtrak's capital dollars, how much of that do we recover via the ticket, essentially? Amtrak's cost recovery ratio is about 80%. So out of $1 spent in expenses, salaries, food, fuel, wheel sets, etc., we cover about 80 cents of that cost via what passengers bring in. So the federal operating infusion is hugely significant, but it is a minority revenue source in terms of compared to passenger fares.
You get a couple billion in.
Excuse me?
You sell a couple of billion in tickets?
Mm-hmm, we do. We are a $4 billion organization. We include ticket fares. Yes. Other questions?
Yeah. I have some very brief comments about the national picture. It's dismal. Routes I used to travel were Las Vegas, Los Angeles doesn't exist. Las Vegas, Salt Lake City does not exist. Denver to Kansas City does not exist. Cincinnati to Detroit, no longer. Cincinnati, St. Louis, no longer. Years ago, I lived in Idaho Falls, Idaho. And I took the Butte Special between Idaho Falls and Salt Lake City. Ran from Salt Lake City to Pocatello, Idaho, to Idaho Falls, to Butte, Montana. These are routes that should be restored. I don't know when that's going to happen. It might be of interest for you to know that in 1946, when Winston Churchill gave his iron speech in Fulton, Missouri, Iron Curtain speech in Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, he and Harry Truman traveled from Washington to Fulton, Missouri by train. And one further comment, I think further security on passenger trains is ridiculous. The last time an American train was hijacked, it was done by Jesse James.
Well, I mean, as I said, the configuration of the network does not necessarily reflect market reality, because you are right. How can one justify no passenger service to Las Vegas? How can one justify no passenger service to Nashville or Houston less than every single day of the week? You're absolutely right. But the issue is that line item, well, those two, capital and operations. If you want those things, and you have my complete support for those outcomes, this nation has to fund them. So I have dreams of trains. I used to ride the Floridian, the Montrealer, I rode the Hiawatha. I understand, and I wish I could provide those things to you. But until this nation makes a commitment to fund inner city rail, then your work is to continue articulating the benefits of those services so that you can get the funds to actually realize them. So it's not that Amtrak doesn't want to operate a more robust national network. We do. We now have a mandate to do so. But that mandate does not mean much, although it means something. It doesn't mean much in the absence of actual capital and operating funding. This side of the room, yes.
The Amtrak reports talk about the great difficulty of operating this on the annual appropriation cycle. And moving over to another model where you can actually plan for the future instead of this fiscal year. Is there any progress on that scheme with Congress and the White House? Are they buying into any of that, at least as a principle?
Well, it's a good question, and the reauthorization was designed to move us away. It was designed to do a couple of things. And the first is to still have the appropriation cycle, but to make it less contentious, because Congress had already had the arguments. Should there be Amtrak? Should there not be Amtrak? Should we lop off the Northeast Corridor? Should we not? Et cetera, et cetera. That has taken place. And now there is a funding framework. And so what should happen is that Congress should fund at the authorized level. That is not happening. And I think it is going to be hard for that to happen when there is the soundbite friendly statement. We need to hold the line on domestic spending. We need to have austerity. Now, whether you buy into that in terms of inner city rail or not is important for you as a voter. In terms of the nation, it is going to be a hard sell, I think, for, on one hand, folks to hear, we're going to cut back on some services, we're going to scale back investment, yet for Amtrak, we're going to make an exception. So you're right. At the end of the day, we do have to move away from the appropriation cycle. And that is why in our equipment plan, we very frankly stated that paradigm is not going to work in order to replace the fleet. There's got to be another strategy, and that may be a reform. Because you're right, we can't do the things that need to get done if we're constantly managing a disparity between what we are entitled to, and I mean that's what we regularly, versus what we get. So you're right, but again, we are subordinate to the federal government. So why the president has proposed an amount that is less than the authorized amount, we don't know. We have certainly done our job explaining why that number is important, the higher number. But that's not the one in play, so we see what happens.
Thank you, gentlemen.